Good morning, everybody. And once again, I want to wish you a Happy New Year. I know this is actually the second Sunday into the new year, but still, Happy New Year to those of you who maybe I haven't seen since then. We've been gone from the study of David for a couple of weeks, so we're going to return to that again this morning. Let me start by asking you this, though. Anger. Is anger a good emotion or a bad emotion? It can be both, right? I mean, who gave us anger? God, and there's a reason that He gave us that emotion. But as you've probably heard Beverly say before, anger is never a primary emotion. Anger is always spurred by another emotion. And oftentimes that emotion is frustration. But anger is a choice that can easily become a habit. And in 1972, in this book entitled Your Erroneous Zones, Wayne Dyer wrote these words: "Anger is a learned reaction to frustration in which you behave in ways that you would rather not. In fact, severe anger is a form of insanity. You're insane whenever you're not in control of your behavior. Therefore, when you're angry and out of control, you are temporarily insane." That sounds like pretty strong, doesn't it? But I checked this out with Beverly, and that's the reality of the situation. How many IQ points do you drop when you're in anger? Up to 50 IQ points. How many of you can afford that kind of loss of IQ? Now, for me, I'm still in range of being pretty good, you know? That's a joke. And you can ask Beverly about that. But you might be surprised to know how accurately this quote describes David in our story today. This man who is quoted more than any other Old Testament character in the New Testament. This man whose biography is longer than anyone else in the Old Testament. This remarkable man who modeled patience and restraint when Saul was trying to murder him. He finally loses control for a period of time. And as we're going to see today, if it wasn't for somebody intervening in our story, David would be guilty of genocide. So, let's set the stage. You might remember, if you were with us the last time we were in David, we left him after he had come out of the cave after sparing Saul's life, and he gives a speech to Saul out there, and Saul makes amends, and it sounds like everything's worked out, right? You remember all that? We come to chapter 25 and verse 1, and it says, "Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. Then David moved down into the desert of Paran." So Samuel is the last of the judges. And as he's getting older, you might remember that the people came to Samuel and asked him if they would replace him with what? With a king. And Samuel warns the people of the consequences of having a king. And they're now suffering those consequences under Saul. Samuel's played an important role in David's life. He's the one who came and anointed David to be the next king. He's one in whom David has found counsel. He's one in whom David has found a source of comfort and strength. And now this great man is gone. And the nation mourns. And so does David. In fact, the biblical text, and sometimes we want to take things literally in the Bible that we wouldn't do in other places. If I was to say everyone in Decatur came out for some event, would you think that literally meant every person in Decatur? And so it says that all of Israel came. Well, it's hard for me to imagine that from 80 miles from north to south and, however many miles, everybody in Israel came to mourn for Samuel. Probably not. But it does make me at least wonder if during this short lull in Saul's pursuit of David, could it be that both Saul and David are there to mourn Samuel? We don't know. David's probably about 26 years old now at this time, and Saul is still king. So David and his 600 guerrilla fighters moved to the desert of Paran. It's also called in Scripture Maon. And so they moved to this area of the desert. This, by the way, is the same area of the desert from which Moses had sent out the 12 spies. Okay? And here they are, David and his men, and they're working behind the scenes. They're kind of like guardian angels. They're protecting the shepherds and the sheep of other people from marauders, from bandits. They're kind of like an unofficial neighborhood watch group, you might say. Some have suggested, though, that what David and his group is actually doing is they're more like the mafia, where they're working as a protection racket. Now, we've all seen enough TV shows to know what that's about, right? Where the mafia comes to your store and says, you pay us this, or not only will we not protect you, we'll see that something bad happens to you, okay? Some have suggested that's what David's doing here, but there's nothing in the text really to suggest that. But by now, David is known far and wide throughout Israel for his heroic exploits. He's known, everyone knows about him killing Goliath. And his estranged relationship with Saul would now be public knowledge. And so he's probably perceived favorably by most people in Israel. Because they're not crazy about Saul. He's not the most popular guy in the world, okay? And so that's where I want us to pick up the story. In verse 2, it says, a certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. And then I don't know why this is added. He was a Calebite. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. Now here we're introduced to two main characters in our story, Nabal and Abigail. And when you think of their differences, think of Rick and Beverly. Okay? I mean, they're about as different as we are. Don't make all the comparisons here, though, because Nabal's name means what? Fool. So please don't make the total analogy between them and Beverly and me. Some of you already have done that, I'm sure. Abigail, what's her name mean? My father is delighted. We're told four things about Nabal in this story. First of all, we're told that he's rich. Actually, that's not the word that's used. The Hebrew word that's used is that he was heavy. But in context, it'd be like us saying, hey, that person is loaded. And not drunk loaded, but when we say someone's loaded, we know they've got a lot of money. Secondly, he's got an intelligent, beautiful wife. Third, he is surly, is what the word says. And that word means stubborn, harsh, difficult, cruel. But that's not enough. He's not just surly. It then says that he was mean. And that word suggests that he was mistreating other people. He's abusive. David's son Solomon's going to write these words in Proverbs. The lips of fools bring them strife, and their mouths invite a beating. This is Nabal. And what's about to happen in this story is his lips are inviting a beating. So, sheep shearing, we still see this in agricultural communities in America. but at sheep shearing time or at harvest time. It's a time of celebration. And so that would be the case here with Nabal as well. It was a time of abundance. It's a time of celebration. And there was a custom in that day. The custom was that it was common for the owner of sheep to set aside a portion of his profits, and he would give that to those who have worked behind the scenes protecting his sheep, protecting his shepherds. It was something like today when we tip a waiter. Okay? There is nothing written in law that says we have to tip a waiter. But it's the accepted practice, right? You with me? So David and his men have been providing this protection for Nabal. And David now got it in mind, well, it's time for the tip. And as we're going to see, Nabal thinks otherwise. Nabal's the guy that stiffs the waiter. Okay? Verse 5 says this. This is speaking of David. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours.' Now I hear that it's sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they'll tell you. Therefore be favorable toward my men, since we've come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them." When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name. Then they waited. So David's men greet Nabal with these words of blessing, these words of well wishes. And they don't ask for anything outrageous here. Okay? And what's Nabal's response? Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse?" Which, by the way, nothing that the servant said anything about him being the son of Jesse. Right? It's a put down. It's a put down Saul has used before. Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where? Who is this David? He knows who David is. This is intended to be a put down. He's mocking David here. He says that David's no different than many other runaway slaves of their days with a handful of worthless followers. And his response is laced with insult after insult. How would you take that? Verse 12 says, David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. Now, David has many admirable qualities as we read his story. Would you agree? But David's not perfect. And David makes a number of mistakes in his life. And one of those mistakes is his response to Nabal. Verse 13 says, David said to his men, "Each of you strap on your sword." So they did, and David strapped his on as well. And about 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. No, wait a minute. Isn't this the same guy that 3 weeks ago we were bragging about because he had shown so much restraint and so much patience with Saul, who was trying to do what? Murder him. And he showed great restraint. And now here's a guy who has insulted him. And he's ready to come against this guy with 400 soldiers. You think that's a little bit of overkill? This would be like trying to kill a fly with a shotgun. David's out of control. And Nabal's insults, they do invite a beating, but that doesn't mean David has to take him up on the beating. In fact, David's ready not only to silence Nabal, he is ready to kill all of his men. Listen to what he says in verse 22. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him. Really? This guy insults you, and you're ready to commit genocide. Isn't this the same guy who we admired for his refusal to retaliate against Saul? But now someone has insulted him, and everything's changed. He's now acting as irrational as Saul acted against the priest of Nob. You remember that? He not only has the priest killed who had given David the showbread, he has every priest killed, and then what did he do? He wiped out the town. Have you ever overreacted to anything? Maybe just to a degree we're different than David. I think all of us have probably overreacted at some point, right? Well, fortunately, in this story, there is an intelligent woman who steps into the story at this point. And by doing so, she prevents David from making a terrible mistake. It's Abigail. A servant of Nabal's returns to Abigail, and he updates her on what is actually taking place at that moment, that there are 400 men coming to kill Nabal. And he tells her, look, David has been good to us. And Nabal insulted him. And so verse 17 says, now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He's such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. Abigail doesn't waste a moment. It says Abigail acted quickly. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. How long would it take to fix all that? Right? A few days. Unless this is something you can prepare beforehand. I don't know, maybe she had a bunch of these raisin cakes and things like that. But this is a lot of food that she loads up. She doesn't load up really a whole lot of wine for 400 men, does she? And she doesn't really load up a whole lot of sheep. 5 dressed sheep for 400 guys. It's not going to go too terribly far. But it's still quite a bit of food that she's loaded on these donkeys. Then she told her servants, go on ahead, I'll follow you. But she did not tell her husband, Nabal. Why do you think she didn't tell her husband? Yeah, and what have we just said about him? He's unapproachable, right? I mean, excuse the language here. This guy's a jerk, okay? And she knows she can't deal with him. So she goes without his knowledge. And as Phil said, he never would have, if he knew that she was getting ready to do that, he never would have allowed her to go, right? Which would have been the same as her writing her own death warrant, as well as her husband's, and as well as all these other men. So she goes. She goes without his knowledge, but she's going on his behalf, right? She runs interference for her husband. And in doing so, she saved not only her husband's life, but the lives of countless other people. And so picture this. Here's David and his 400 men, and they've got their swords ready, and they're coming down this hill. Well, actually, it says a mountain, but again, as I've told you, in Israel, mountains they call them mountains, but it's more like us calling the hill country in Texas mountains. I mean, they're hills. And so he's coming down this hill, and verse 20 says this: as she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. Skip down to verse 23. No, I'm sorry, go back. When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. Now, it's obvious that Abigail has thought through this whole thing. And last time we were in our study, I mentioned that David's speech to Saul when he came out of the cave, you remember, that is the longest speech, the longest uninterrupted speech by anybody in the Old Testament. And as he addressed Saul, that's his longest speech that we have. But Abigail's speech to David is the longest unbroken speech by a female in all of Scripture. And I want you to notice her response. I want you to notice in her response her humility. I want you to notice her loyalty. I want you to notice her tact and even her faith. Here's what she said, verse 24. She fell at his feet and said, "Pardon your servant, my Lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Please pay no attention, my Lord, to that wicked man Nabal." I hope when I've made the comparison with Beverly and me, I hope Beverly never tells anybody else. I hope she doesn't refer to me as being wicked, okay? He's just like his name. His name means fool, and fool goes with him, and folly goes with him. As for me, your servant, I did not see the men my Lord sent. And now, my Lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my Lord be like Nabal. And let this gift which your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the men who follow you. Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone's pursuing you to take your life, the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. By the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him, and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, remember your servant. In his commentary on 1st and 2nd Samuel, Eugene Peterson, who is the guy who wrote the translation, The Message, which I enjoy reading for devotional reading, by the way. Eugene Peterson, in his commentary, he restates Abigail's words, and this is the way he puts it. Your task, David, is not to exact revenge or vengeance. Vengeance is God's business, and you're not God. You're out here in the wilderness to find out what God is doing and who you are before God. The wilderness is not an experimental station in which you test yourself to find out how strong and resilient you are. It's where you discover the strength of God and God's faithful ways of working in and through your life. Nabal is a fool, but don't you also become a fool. One fool's enough in this story. Here's David's response. David said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak. Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought him and said, "Go home in peace. I've heard your words and granted your request." So here's David, sword at the ready. I mean, he is ready to go shed some blood. Racing toward this evil with anger and revenge flowing through his veins. And yet he stopped. And he listened. And this again is one of the reasons I think he's called a man after God's own heart. He's got some rough edges on him, doesn't he? But he has a teachable spirit. And we see that over and over again in his story. And he listens without interrupting. And he's willing to change when he is faced with who he is. I don't know if there's any characteristic he has that's more like a man after God's own heart than that. And actually, I guess it would be hard for a hungry man to be rude to a woman who's just brought a smorgasbord out there for them. But David models genuine humility here. And the result is, David and his men return to where they were from, and they've got provisions for a while. And Abigail goes home, where her husband puts his arms around her and says, "I am so grateful for you. You're the most wonderful wife. Thank you, honey. You're more valuable than rubies." Don't you wish that was the story? Here's what happened. When Abigail went to Nabal, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until daybreak. So when she gets home, Fool is so drunk that she can't even talk to him. And I just wonder if maybe she went to bed that night crying out to the Lord and wondering if she would ever have a husband who would treat her with appreciation. Next morning, after Fool sobered up, she tells him what happened. Note his reaction. Then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. What do you think David's describing there? A stroke. That's what it sounds like. Nabal hears that there were 400 men getting ready to come and cut him down. And he has a stroke right there on the spot. And 10 days later, he died. Well, when David hears about him dying, David says, "Blessed be God. God kept me from murdering this guy. And if vengeance is required, let God take it." That sounds pretty biblical, doesn't it? And then David sends a wedding proposal to Abigail. And she accepts it. And it's here at this point that I want to address an elephant in the room. In the Old Testament, we see a number of examples of polygamy, don't we? In fact, to the point that there are some people who claim that the Bible teaches that polygamy is okay. Let's realize that what we're reading is simply historical narrative. Let's not make the mistake of thinking that everything that we read about in the Bible is endorsed by God. And just because people that are even heroes to us did something, it does not mean God approved of it. You with me? Okay. In fact, when it came to God's discussion of kings, and this is actually hundreds of years before they even have a king, God is already putting in place, this is what you need to do when you have a king. It's in Deuteronomy, chapter 17 and verse 17. Speaking of kings, he must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. Do we see that happening in Scripture? We're not sure how Solomon ended up. I would like to think, and some scholars think, that he wrote Ecclesiastes, and it shows kind of that he's come back to God. But we know at one point he's totally taken away from God by his foreign wives, right? So David, what do we know about his wives? Who did he marry first? Remember? Michal, who was Saul's daughter. And why was he married to Michal? She was part of the trophy given for David killing Goliath. But when David flees from Saul, Saul gives Michal to another man. But then we're told here, if you read on, that David marries Abigail, and then there's also mention of another wife. Her name is Ahinoam. Who else does he later marry? Bathsheba? Okay, so David's a polygamist, right? So, while David is the anointed one of God, David is not perfect. And David is not the final solution. Figuratively, in Scripture, David is pointing forward to the final solution. Who is called the Son of David? Jesus. He's the final solution. Messiah. So, what's the lesson for us in this? Well, obviously there's a lesson to us about uncontrolled anger. But I think there's also a lesson for us about revenge not being ours to take. I'm beginning a study this morning of Philippians. And here's a passage from Philippians chapter 2. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interest of others. This verse really needs to be etched on the hearts of every Christian today. When Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians to that church, he noted how they were suing each other. They were taking other people in their church to court. And what did Paul tell them they ought to do? He said, can't you just be wronged? And everything in us as Americans pushes back against that, doesn't it? Can't you just be wronged? And I want us to think about this. Because so much of the way we behave is shaped by our culture. So many Christians are living with this attitude today that's a tit-for-tat kind of attitude. You did something to me, I'll get you back. Tell me what part of Scripture that sounds like. Tell me what from God that sounds like. I can't tell you. It seems like often in recent days, and particularly with this, I can't even remember what the slogan is. Someone came up with it at a baseball game or something, and I think it's that a lot of people are now saying, what is it, Beverly? Do you remember? Yes. Let's go, Brandon. Are you familiar with this? There are Christians that on their Facebook, we've seen Christians wearing T-shirts that say, "Let's go Brandon." You might want to look it up to find out what that's really a way of saying. And I have seen people questioning Christians for doing that. And I've heard too many Christians say this: well, they didn't treat our candidate the way that they should have, so we're not going to treat their candidate that way either. That sounds so much like Jesus. Not. Brothers and sisters, someone has to stop this spiral. So much of how we behave, it has to be stopped. It's an evil spiral. And if we do wrong to somebody who has wronged us, all we're doing is continuing this evil spiral. Why should we do right when someone has done us wrong? Let's just bottom line it. Why should we do right when someone has done us wrong? Because that's what Jesus did for us. We did not receive from Jesus what we deserved. And in fact, I'm not talking about just once. We do not receive what we deserve from Jesus. And we can do good to people who do not deserve it, because Jesus did good to us when we don't deserve it. And it is the way of Jesus. Is it easy? No. Does it come naturally? No. Does it push back against everything that my culture is telling me? Yes. But it's the right thing to do. And remember this, I'm a big believer in this. Our actions affect our outcomes. Some religions would call that karma. Other religions would call that kismet. I say it is a law that God has built into nature itself. And Paul puts it this way: you reap what you sow. And this is a principle by which we should live. That's not only a negative consequence. That's often the way we use that. You reap what you sow. We think of it negatively. If you do something bad, you're going to get something bad done to you. Well, that's kind of in the idea of kismet, karma. But this has a positive side to it as well. If you sow good stuff, guess what you're going to receive in return? Good stuff. It's built into the very nature of the universe, and it is the way of God. It is the way of God in healing a broken world. So, we got 3 minutes left. Any questions, comments? Yes. Good point. Not when your IQs drop 50 points. In fact, as I was talking with Beverly, and tell me, you can word this better than me, but I want to remind you kind of what you said. Beverly said that oftentimes when you talk to a person who has had an angry moment and tell them what they said, they'll say, "I didn't say that." Because in that moment, you're insane, as the quote said. And we can't even recall what was actually said. Or we'll have a distorted view of what was actually said. Tell me if I need to add something to that, or if that's worded okay. is fight and flight. Mm-hmm. Okay.